Okay, in this presentation we're going to review some of the recommended procedures for sample collection, preservation, and shipping. Most of you likely have your own standard way of collecting blood from poultry, but if you don't, I'll provide you with some possibilities on ways that you can collect blood. Those of you who do have procedures already pretty much in hand, you probably realize that chicken blood does not particularly separate well. And so often if you collect blood, you don't often get good expression of the serum from the clot unless you have a lot of exposure of that clot to air. And so one way that you can get good separation of serum from the clot is that if you use your standard method of bleeding birds and collect somewhere around 3 to 4 ml in a 5 cc syringe, for example, as you see in this particular diagram, when you finish collecting your blood, extend the plunger to the very end. In other words, pull it as far back as it will go without actually pulling it out of the barrel. And this then allows for additional air in the barrel. And if you just lay those syringes down horizontally and leave them at room temperature overnight, usually you will get good separation as you see in this particular picture. Then the following morning, often that clot will adhere to the rubber of the plunger, and you can just then pull the plunger out from the back of the barrel and pour the serum into a vial. In most cases, the vial will not even require centrifugation because most of the red cells will be retained in the clot. So this is a good way to collect serum from birds. But there are many other ways as well. Also, which we will demonstrate in the lab, is that the antibody in yolk often correlates fairly well with the circulating antibody in serum. And so for surveillance purposes, yolk antibody testing can be used to monitor certain types of production flocks for avian influenza. Breeders as well as table egg layers can be easily sampled in this manner. The advantages of using yolk serology is that you don't have to be concerned with biosecurity going on the farm to collect these samples. These samples can all be collected at processing plants very easily. The processing of this yolk is simply dilute 1 to 2 or 1 part of PBS, 1 part of yolk, and then vigorously vortex this over 3 or 4 times over a period of about 1 hour. And then they can be centrifuged at 1500 times G for about 30 to 45 minutes to get a nice translucent layer in which the antibodies will be present. And then this can be used as the equivalent to undiluted serum. Now, the 3 types of samples that are typically most often used for serology are, of course, the serum, the plasma, and egg yolk. Can all be used on the screening test, the AGID and ELISA, as well as the subtyping test, the HI and NI tests. So it all has good utilization. As you know, if you have positive samples and you need to do subtype confirmation, we do need somewhere between 1/2 ml and 1 ml of serum or the plasma or yolk. And we need this because we have 16 different HIs to perform and 9 different neuraminases to perform. So we do need a fair amount of serum to get that done correctly. As far as samples for virus isolation or nucleic acid detection, we've talked about this before in other presentations. As far as tissue, lung and spleen are very good tissues for both avian influenza and Newcastle disease diagnosis. We have asked that you not pool tissues from different birds because each bird could be at a different stage of disease, and it's possible that you can have neutralization of the virus of a bird that has antibody with one that's still virus positive. So we do not recommend pooling tissues from different birds. You can pool tissues from the same bird, however. Swabs are very good samples. Both tracheal or oropharyngeal have shown to be equal in sensitivity for both Newcastle and avian influenza. Cloacal swabs are another good source of virus, and we have pooled very successfully up to 5 pools or 5 swabs per pool. What we have recommended more recently is that we not pool the tracheal or oropharyngeal swabs with the cloacal swabs. And the reason for that is that the cloacal swabs are more problematic for RNA detection. In other words, a lot of times these cloacal swabs, we have difficulty extracting the RNA from these, and also the presence of PCR inhibitors are a lot more frequent in cloacal swabs than they are in tracheal or oropharyngeal swabs. As far as the type of swab that we recommend, we actually recommend Dacron swabs on plastic shafts. That is the direction that we are going at the present time. We have used cotton tip swabs on wooden shafts, but some manufacturers, the wooden shafts may contain formalin, which, if the swabs are allowed to remain in the transport media, that formalin could leach out into the medium and interfere with PCR amplification. So I think if you stay with the Dacron swabs on a plastic shaft, will give you the best type of sample. I also have in this particular picture the calcium alginate swabs, and for a period of time, because of their small size, they were very popular for collecting samples from small birds. But calcium alginate swabs do interfere with the amplification of the RNA or the DNA or cDNA in the PCR reaction. I believe there are some new varieties or new brands of small Dacron swabs on these metal shafts, which could be used for smaller birds. But do not use the calcium alginate swabs for PCR testing. Now, as far as collecting samples, this is a picture of a tracheal swab. If you've ever tried to collect a tracheal swab, you'll soon realize that it's not as easy as it looks on this particular picture. This bird has had its tongue extracted from the mouth, thus bringing the trachea or the opening of the trachea up in a very visible position. But if you were doing this naturally, it's very difficult to get that swab in the trachea. Therefore, we've looked at some alternative methods, and we found that the oropharyngeal swabs are just about as good as actual tracheal swabs. And for this, we recommend that you insert your swab and swab the area around the opening of the trachea. And then as you bring that swab out of the oral cavity, we recommend that you swab also the choanal cleft, which you can see on the lower right-hand picture of this slide. And you simply just swab that area, and these swabs then have shown equivalency with the tracheal swab. And they're much easier and much faster to collect. Now, as far as the type of material or transport media that's used, there are a variety that would be acceptable. What is important is that the volume be somewhere between 2 and 4 ml. If you have too small a volume, then you don't have enough material to do all of the diagnostic tests that are required. If you use too much, you run the risk of diluting your sample to the point where it may not be detected by some of the diagnostic tests. But all of these different viral transport medias have kind of one thing in common, is that they are high in protein. Brain heart infusion is the broth that we recommend and we have used for the last 20 years. It works quite well, and the virus is quite comfortable in this particular medium. But there are other viral transport media or TB nutrient broth. A lot of these will provide similar protection to the virus. And of course, within the laboratory, you need to develop a specimen handling system whereby each specimen can be followed through the laboratory with absolute identification. And of course, your samples must make sure that they agree with the paperwork so that you can report individual results for individual samples to the submitter. Now, in terms of numbers of samples, both for Newcastle and influenza, for serology, generally 20 to 30 samples per flock is considered sufficient. And I'll show you some other examples in just a moment. But that will give you 95% confidence that at least one sample will be positive if the infection rate in that flock is 10% or greater. And that's typically a 95 confidence interval is what is used with 10%, is what is used as an acceptable confidence for surveillance for Newcastle and avian influenza. As far as tissues, typically we would require or request tissues from 3 to 5 birds. This would be if it were in domestic poultry. If you're sampling wild birds, of course, you probably would keep each bird separate. But we do not recommend pooling tissue from different birds because of what we've already discussed. As far as swabs, again, the same as for serology. We'd have a 95% confidence interval of 10% infection levels, 20 to 30 swabs, pooled fiber tubes would do the job just fine. This table kind of gives you some differences of the number of samples required to meet different confidence interval samplings. So you can see that under the 95% confidence, and what I have here is the number in the flock would be 50, 100, 500, 1,000, and basically an infinite population. And then we have the confident interval of 95% of detecting infection or the incidence of 1% or 5% or 10%. So you can see in the 95-10 that 29 samples would be required from basically a population of any size, of an infinite size. If you have a very low number of birds, such as 50, you're almost going to have to sample half of those to get that same level of confidence. So depending on the size of the flock will determine how many samples you should collect. Now, just to compare the 10% level of infection at a 95% confidence level requires 29 samples. If you lower that to 5% infection within a flock, you almost have to double your sampling to get the same confidence in detecting at least one positive bird in that sampling rate. And you can see that if your confidence interval is 99%, with 1% infection, 5% infection, or 10% infection, the numbers are significantly higher, but not so much higher on the 99% with 10% infection. You only have to have 44 samples. But you can see if you want 1% infection level, you almost have to collect 450 samples, which is not practical in most cases. Now, as far as the preservation of the samples, serum, typically 4 degrees for several weeks would be fine. If you know you're going to store them for longer periods of time, minus 20 would be very acceptable. One thing you should avoid is using frost-free freezers, because that cycling of temperatures to defrost those freezers is detrimental for the preservation of the serum. So you want to use a non-frost-free freezer for storage. As far as tissues and swabs, both Newcastle and influenza are quite stable if maintained at 4 degrees. And you could leave them at that temperature from 2 to 4 days without appreciable decrease in titer. So if we know you're going to do long-term storage, minus 70 or colder would be recommended. And it is not recommended that virus tissue or swabs be stored at minus 20 degrees. It would be better to keep them at 4 degrees for 3 or 4 days than to freeze them at minus 20 and have to thaw them again. This graph just kind of shows the stability of the original highly pathogenic H5N1 from Hong Kong back in 1997. And you can see that the virus, if it's in a high protein environment, such as wet feces, if kept at 4 degrees, over 40 days there was really no appreciable change in virus titer. So that suggests that the virus is very comfortable if it's kept cool, wet, in a high protein environment. If we take that same feces and just store it at room temperature instead of 4 degrees, the virus remains viable for about 1 week. If we have the temperatures at 35, we will have viable virus for up to about 2 days. But if we dry the sample, it's essentially the virus is gone within 1 day. So the two enemies of influenza virus would be heat and dryness. So if it's kept cool, and that's why we see most infections of influenza in the cool and humid times of the year, usually the spring and the fall. Now a little bit about shipping samples, not only to the National Veterinary Services Lab, but this would apply to any laboratory pretty much in the world. And the intent of what I'm going to tell you should only be the basis for you to do further work in this area, because the regulations on shipping diagnostic samples or even known viruses has changed significantly in the last few years, and it's still evolving on a regular basis. So I'm going to provide you with some references to find information in addition to what I will tell you today. Certainly for a laboratory to ship a diagnostic sample suspected of being infected with high-path H5N1, you would have to go through approximately an 8-hour training course and be certified to be able to ship these. So obviously we're not going to cover all of that material satisfactorily in this presentation, but I want to give you some things to think about. Now many of the samples that are submitted to our lab as well as other labs, reference labs throughout the world, are considered hazardous material by the Department of Transportation or as dangerous goods by the International Air Transport Association. Now basically these terms mean the same thing. It's just that the DOT and IATA have chose to use slightly different words. But we will probably use the term dangerous goods throughout the rest of this presentation. Now the dangerous goods that are shipped to reference laboratories really include either the infectious substance, which is a diagnostic sample, known or reasonably suspected to contain a pathogen, or it could be a culture of an unknown pathogen, or it could be a toxin. Now pathogens are really defined as microorganisms, and this includes bacteria, viruses, rickettsia, parasites, fungi, etc., or other agents such as prions that can cause disease in humans or animals. Now, there are 9 classes of dangerous goods, and we'll focus primarily on class 6 in this presentation because these are the infectious substances classified as hazardous materials. The United States Department of Transportation is responsible for regulations concerning shipments within the U.S. The DOT regulations concerning these shipments of infectious substances can be found in the 49 Code of Federal Regulations, Parts 171 through 175, as we see here in this particular slide. And I have given also the website for these regulations as well. Now, in addition to the DOT regulations, all shipments sent via air must also comply with the International Air Transport Association regulations, or IATA. IATA's regulations were written in response to the international need for harmonization of air transport regulations. And there has been a good attempt to coordinate the requirements for both the DOT and IATA, so they should be fairly similar. Now, the purpose of the IATA and the DOT regulations is really to assure the acceptable level of safety for all involved in the transportation of dangerous goods. And that would include the shipper, the receiver, the public, and the environment. And that's why these rules were generated. So, who do these regulations apply to? Well, essentially they apply to anyone that's involved with the transport or the preparation of these materials for transport primarily by air. And these regulations also apply to anyone who ships any infectious substance or dry ice to any laboratory in the world. So it's very broad in scope. Now the DOT and IATA regulations require that the shippers of dangerous goods be trained, and that's very important. And this training must be adequate for the shipper's responsibility, and it must include an overview of general regulations, specific training on the class of dangerous goods being shipped, and safety training. And safety training should include the safe handling and emergency response should there be an accident during shipment. Now this training is valid for a period of 2 years, and it may be necessary for additional training if the regulations change within this 2-year period. And it's very likely that there will be additional changes forthcoming. The training must include a certifying exam, and the shipper must pass the exam before the certificate is issued. So you need to plan ahead. So if you anticipate your laboratory is going to be sending samples to a reference laboratory or even to a regional laboratory, you need to have all of this training completed in advance so that you don't have a delay in getting your samples shipped to those respective laboratories. Now the adequate and reoccurring training courses for safety really are for the benefit of everyone, and I think it's a very important activity and something that we all have to adhere to. Now, as far as what are the responsibilities of the shipper? Well, basically these are the list of things that the shipper has to do. It has to classify, identify, package, mark, label, document, and assign a person to which the samples will be shipped. So, and usually there is a checklist that has to be included with the shipment to make sure all of these things have been properly done. Now let's just review the classes as they apply to commonly shipped samples. Toxins are classified as 6.1 agents, and infectious substances are 6.2. And you notice that dry ice is under miscellaneous category 9. Now these dangerous goods are also assigned a proper shipping name, and that is found in IATA 4.2 if you go to their website. But the proper shipping names are used for just basically consistency and are used in shipping documents and notifications that must be present on each of the packages that are shipped. Now the UN number is essentially a 4-digit number, and that's assigned by the United Nations Committee of Experts on the Transportation of Dangerous Goods, and that's why the UN precedes the 4-digit number. And this 4-digit number, or the proper shipping name, must be listed on the shipping form of the package. Now, essentially there are 2 categories of agents. There's a category A, which are the bad guys, and then there's a category B, which basically is most of the, well, it's any agents that's not a category A, which is pretty convenient, but it's more or less the run-of-the-mill type diseases that we encountered in diagnostic labs. But these are some examples of category A, the bad guys, and within that category we have 2 different UN numbers. We have a UN 2814 that's assigned to organisms that are infectious and can infect humans. Some examples would be Hendra, Nipah, Rift Valley, Eastern and Venezuelan encephalitis, West Nile, and of course the highly pathogenic avian influenza. And this refers to cultures only. Now, this is not the complete list. There are many others, and you always have to make sure that you have the most recent updated list. These are some other examples of Category A, mostly of bacterial nature. So brucella, anthrax, chlamydia, etc. are some examples. All UN 2814. Now we have a UN 2900 category, and these are agents that are infectious and affect animals only. And of course, African horse sickness, ASF, Newcastle, and blue tongue are some examples. Now we also talked already about the possibility that Newcastle can cause conjunctivitis in people, so it does affect people, but nonetheless it's still in a category UN 2900, what is considered to be infectious for animals only. Now, in the Category B, again, these are all the organisms that are not specifically listed as Category A agents. And so within the Category B, we have three numbers that are primarily used. The UN 3373, which basically apply to the diagnostic specimens. We have, again, a UN 2814 for humans, 2900 for animals. Now, within the Category A and Category B agents, we do have different requirements for packing. Obviously, the 602, which are the Category A agents, require a higher safety standard than those of Category B, which have packing instructions 650. Now, these packing instructions are listed on the various websites, and I'm not going to go through them, but I just wanted to bring them to your attention that there are different packing requirements depending on if it's a Category A or Category B agent. Now, as far as shipments of Category A, I'm not going to go into any detail on what the requirements are for these agents, but it is important that if you're going to send a Category A agent to any laboratory in the world, you need to contact that laboratory prior to sending the samples and see if there's any permits that may be required to accompany those samples in shipment. Now, as far as the Category B guidelines, basically they have to be in leak-proof containers, primary and secondary, and we have to have sufficient absorbent material to absorb all the material that might be present in that shipment, so that if it is destroyed by an accident or whatever, it will not run all over and expose other people. There's some examples of a primary container on the left here, samples 1, 2, and 3, that are then put around absorbent material around those samples, and then they're put in another airtight or a container that can resist a fair amount of impact and abuse. That container then is placed in the shipping box, and if you're going to ship it with dry ice, you need to put your dry ice then and inside a plastic bag. But what you should not do is seal the box if you have dry ice in that package, because as that dry ice sublimates and turns into a gas, if it's totally sealed, it could technically explode. So you don't want to seal those boxes. Just fold the plastic over and allow the gases to escape without being restricted. Now, as far as the requirements for labeling the shipping boxes for Category B agents, we can see the box on the left. We have a sticker indicating that it's an infectious substance. We have the label, the shipping label, with the person that it's going to be shipped to with a phone number for contact. We have another red sticker here that indicates a biomedical materials, and we also have one that indicates dry ice. On the picture on the right, we of course have the proper shipping name. This is a UN 2900, which indicates that it's a sample that probably is infectious only to animals. For regular diagnostic samples, sometimes just ship them with a frozen gel pack is sufficient to keep them in good shape during the transit. In this particular diagram in the box on the right, we have a UN 3373, which just essentially says it's a diagnostic specimen in Category B. Now, these are some examples of the forms and permits that would be required if you're going to submit samples to the National Veterinary Services Lab. Now, if you're using other labs, each of these labs will probably have their own forms and requirements for shipping. So contact these labs prior to your shipping samples to them to make sure that you have the proper documentation. And these are also available on various websites, which I have provided you on the bottom of this particular slide. This is also the contact information for NVSL should you wish to send samples to us for characterization. If you're going to send samples here, we do ask that you need a USDA permit, and you will have to call us to get that, and we will fax that permit to you, and then you can use the, we'll have instructions that go with that permit for shipping samples to the NVSL. Here's the address to ship to our lab. And with that, I thank you for your attention and hope that this has provided you some basic information to at least make you realize that if you're going to ship samples by air, you need to plan ahead and get this training and documentation done in advance so that you won't have a delay in getting your samples to a diagnostic lab.